There are truths that were never meant to be spoken aloud, truths whispered only in the backrooms of power, covered in blood, silence, and shame. And tonight you will hear one. Imagine a child. Her name is Isabella, barely old enough to spell her own name, yet dragged into a chamber where the walls seemed to breathe, where shadows weren't just shadows but watching eyes. They told her this was family. They told her this was tradition. And they told her if she ever spoke of it, her tongue would be cut out and fed to the fire. The year was 1989, and the world outside carried on. Shopping malls, neon lights, and the illusion of innocence. But underground, Isabella was trapped in a theater of horrors that would scar her forever. What you're about to hear is not simply a story of a girl's suffering. It is a window into a hidden machinery that has operated for centuries, a network of control so insidious that most who encounter it never escape alive. But Isabella did. And her story reveals more than ritual. It reveals the very structure of power itself. She was not born into freedom. Isabella's earliest memories were chains disguised as lullabies. The cult she was born into wore the mask of family, but it was a bloodline chained to darkness. Her grandmother, the matriarch, was the smiling face of cruelty, a woman who could bake bread by day and command the slaughter of innocents by night. They told Isabella she had been chosen, that she was marked, that her very birth was an offering. From the moment she could walk, she was prepared for ceremonies that no human being should ever witness. Candles taller than her body, circles of men with faces hidden by masks, chanting names that froze her blood. At first she thought every child lived like this. But by the age of 6 she realized there was no playground at the end of her days. Only rituals where animals screamed and sometimes children did too. The horror was routine, systematic. It wasn't chaos. It was organized. That was the first crack of realization that what imprisoned her wasn't madness. It was a system, polished, ancient, and protected. There was one night Isabella never forgot. The night of the coffin. She was lowered into a wooden box, spiders poured in beside her, and the lid was sealed shut. She screamed until her voice broke. They said it was a test that if she survived she was strong enough to serve. And while the insects crawled into her ears, her nostrils, her skin, she learned the first rule of survival: silence. She realized no amount of crying brought rescue. The ones who placed her there were the same who pretended to wipe her tears later. This was not punishment, it was training. Training her to fracture inside, to split herself into pieces. One that obeyed and one that dreamed of running. Every survivor of these cults knows this split. It is how they manufacture obedience. Psychological control so absolute it leaves scars deeper than flesh. What Isabella didn't yet know was that this system had names, money, protection, and its reach extended far beyond her grandmother's house. The cult was not isolated. It was plugged into something larger. But there were moments of clarity, flickers of rebellion. Isabella was not broken yet. She began noticing details, the way certain men wore expensive watches, the way luxury cars waited outside after rituals, the way cash flowed through hidden hands. These weren't just sick villagers playing with shadows. These were men of status, connected, untouchable. She overheard whispers about judges, businessmen, even politicians. The realization nearly crushed her. The walls of her prison weren't just built from fear, they were built from power. And power protects itself. To escape would not only mean outrunning her family but outrunning a machine designed to erase anyone who defected. Still, a spark lived inside her. Perhaps it was the natural rebellion of a child. Perhaps it was destiny. Whatever it was, she began storing memories, symbols, patterns. She couldn't name it then, but she was mapping her way out. And in those stolen moments, watching the way the cult operated, she began to see their greatest weakness. That it was during a ritual under the blood moon when Isabella saw something that changed her. They brought out an infant, barely alive, and placed it on the altar. She was forced to stand near, trembling as the chants grew louder. Her grandmother smiled at her, urging her to watch. And as the act unfolded, Isabella did not look away. For the first time she locked her gaze not on the horror, but on the faces of those around her. She noticed their fear too. Even in their cruelty some of them flinched. And in that moment she understood, not all of them wanted to be there. Some were bound by blackmail, others by debt, others by fear worse than hers. This cult thrived on chains, but chains can break. That was the seed. The seed that whispered escape is possible. But the question was how, and how to survive the price of freedom. For Isabella knew if she ever tried to leave, she wouldn't just be hunted. She would be sacrificed. The cult never let her forget that she belonged to them. Every ceremony, every violation, was sealed with the same whispered threat. You cannot leave. You are us. Isabella was told the outside world would never believe her. They told her police were already in their pocket, that doctors and priests bowed to their rituals. She saw enough to believe it. There were men in black suits who attended once in a while, men who arrived in silence, were treated with reverence, and left without their names ever spoken aloud. These men were untouchable. When Isabella tried to imagine escape, the picture always ended the same way, her body dragged back, her name erased. Still, something inside her refused to die. Late at night, when the drugs wore off and the house fell quiet, she would whisper to herself, "One day." Those two words were her prayer, her only resistance. They had stolen her childhood, her body, her innocence, but they had not stolen the part of her that dreamed. And that spark terrified them even if they didn't know it yet. They used every weapon of psychology against her. Fear wasn't enough. They needed to rewire her. Isabella was forced to participate in betrayals, to harm others, to blur the line between victim and accomplice. That is how cults work. Destroy the soul by forcing the victim's hands red. She remembered one night being told to hold the blade. At first she refused. They laughed, beat her, stripped her dignity bare. But they pressed until she obeyed, until she cut the skin of another child just enough to draw blood. She collapsed in tears afterward, believing herself damned. And that is how the control worked. Once she thought she was too guilty to deserve escape, they tightened their grip. This is not just cruelty, it is engineering. A system designed to trap minds forever. But Isabella was different. That night she realized something. If guilt could chain her, it could also be a key. She could pretend to be broken, pretend to be theirs, and in that illusion she might find her opening. And so the performance began. Her grandmother, the Iron Matriarch, believed Isabella was finally molded. She smiled with cruel satisfaction as Isabella bowed her head, played the part, and whispered obedience. But in silence, Isabella's mind raced. She memorized routines. Who entered which door, which keys opened which rooms, the hours when the watchful eyes turned away. She noticed how certain rituals required preparation, long enough for cracks in their vigilance. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was studying them. And that is when she discovered something remarkable. There was a small window in the cellar where she was often locked. Behind the bars, vines grew, and through the vines she could see the road beyond. At night, headlights would sweep across the wall. That road was freedom, close enough to touch but impossible to reach. Still, the window became her obsession. Every chance she had, she tested the bars, scraped at the stone, weakening it bit by bit. Escape was not yet possible, but the plan had been born. But in systems of control, freedom is always met with counterforce. The cult had eyes everywhere. They sensed her flicker of independence, though they could not yet prove it. One night, they punished her in a way that left scars deeper than the coffin of spiders. They forced her to stand before the group, stripped of dignity, and they declared her rebellious. The sentence was symbolic death. They covered her in a burial shroud and placed her in a shallow grave, leaving her there all night. She lay in the dirt, suffocating, believing she had been buried alive. And when dawn broke, they pulled her out, mocking her tears, telling her she had died and been reborn as theirs. To them this was ritual. To Isabella it was revelation. They were terrified enough of her spirit to try to crush it, which meant her spirit mattered. which meant escape wasn't just fantasy, it was destiny. The first attempt came in the summer of 1989. She had studied the bars of the cellar for months. That night, while the cult prepared for a gathering, she used a shard of metal hidden in her dress to pry at the last piece of stone. The bar shifted, groaned, and then broke free. Her heart pounded as she squeezed through, cutting her skin on jagged edges, tumbling into the night air for the first time in years. The road was ahead, wide and empty. She ran barefoot, every sound of the forest behind her echoing like footsteps. But freedom is never given, it must be fought for. She didn't make it far. Headlights appeared. A black car pulled up beside her. Hands grabbed her, dragging her inside. Her grandmother's voice greeted her from the shadows. "Did you really think you could leave?" The punishment that followed would nearly kill her. Yet in that moment of capture, Isabella tasted the outside world. And once you taste freedom, even once, you can never forget it. That taste would keep her alive for what came next. The punishment for her attempted escape was not a beating. No, that would have been too merciful. They dragged Isabella back into the ceremonial hall, where candles flickered like watchful eyes and the air reeked of copper and incense. This was not just discipline, it was theater. They stripped her bare of identity, forcing her to kneel at the altar, her hands tied, while masked figures surrounded her in a circle. At the center was her grandmother, the matriarch, cloaked in crimson. She declared Isabella a child of betrayal and demanded purification. What followed defied the limits of sanity. They poured animal blood over her head, chanting invocations to Lucifer, the bringer of light. She was forced to swallow ashes mixed with bile, told it was the taste of her own soul. And then came the ritual of mirrors. One by one, they placed broken mirrors around her, forcing her to stare at her own reflection fractured into dozens of faces. They told her she was no longer one person, but many, and only they could decide which face she would wear. This was not just abuse, it was psychological programming, engineered to shatter the mind and remake it. Yet as her tears ran, Isabella silently vowed that they would never own her reflection. The cult thrived on ritual, but these were not random acts of madness. They were codified, ancient, drawn from texts Isabella only glimpsed, black books bound in leather, symbols older than memory. One ceremony she witnessed would haunt her forever. They called it the Feast of Silence. Children were placed in coffins and lowered into the hall, while adults chanted in a dead language. The room filled with the sound of muffled cries under the lids. A goat was slaughtered above the coffins, its blood dripping down as baptism. The coffins were then opened and the children dragged out, gasping, covered in gore. They were told they had died and been reborn as servants of Lucifer. Isabella herself endured this once. The suffocating dark, the blood soaking her hair, the moment of forced rebirth. The adults believed this gave them power over death itself. But to Isabella, it only revealed their madness. And yet, behind the madness she saw wealth. The hall was no barn. It was a mansion's hidden chamber lined with stone, adorned with gold symbols, frescoes of demons, and chandeliers that must have cost fortunes. These were not poor fanatics, they were the elite. The punishments grew stranger still. They once forced Isabella to stand in a circle of salt while serpents were released around her. The masked figures chanted, "If she is pure, she will not be bitten." The snakes coiled at her feet, flicking tongues across her skin. She stood frozen, her heart screaming, until the creatures slithered back into the shadows. They roared with laughter, calling her chosen. But Isabella saw something else. The performance wasn't for her. It was for them, for the men who believed fear could make them gods. On another night, she witnessed the banquet of ashes. After a child was aborted, its remains were burned to ash, mixed with wine and consumed. Isabella was forced to drink. The taste stayed in her mouth for weeks. It was their way of binding the victims, ensuring complicity through horror. How could one ever confess to such things? Who would believe it? That secrecy was the cult's greatest weapon. Isabella realized this was why they involved the wealthy and powerful. Once you drank the ashes, once you ate the flesh, you were bound forever by your own guilt. It was not just a cult. It was a web of blackmail stretching into institutions. She began to see the structure. These weren't isolated lunatics. There were ranks, codes, and hidden laws. The council at the top wore gold-trimmed masks and never spoke. Orders were passed in symbols, not words. One ritual involved burning sigils into the skin of victims, each mark tied to a different master. Isabella carried one on her arm, a scar she would keep for life. Another ritual, even more grotesque, was called the marriage of the beast. Girls barely past childhood were dressed in white gowns, veils placed on their heads, and wed to men twice, 3 times their age, sometimes to animals in grotesque mockery. Isabella was spared the full act, but she witnessed others taken. Their screams were muffled by music played on organs, as though the cult had rehearsed how to drown human pain into theater. These were not random ceremonies. They were systems of degradation designed to destroy identity. But Isabella, in silence, memorized every detail. Because she knew, if she survived, if she escaped, these secrets could burn the cult down. The final straw came one night when the ritual escalated beyond anything Isabella had seen. They brought in a stranger, a young man drugged, laughing weakly. He was stripped, bound, and placed on the altar. Isabella watched in terror as her grandmother raised a blade and cut from his throat to his stomach. The man's screams filled the hall, then fell silent. His flesh was carved, distributed like some grotesque communion. Isabella refused to eat, and her grandmother struck her, forcing the bloody meat against her lips. That night, Isabella understood something terrifying. This cult did not just sacrifice animals or unborn children. They sacrificed full-grown men and women, disappearing them from the world. She wondered how many missing persons posters in the city were tied to these walls. And in that moment of despair, she found clarity. If she stayed, she would become either a corpse on that altar or a hollow shell like the masked figures. But if she escaped, if she lived, she could expose them. The seed of her final rebellion took root that night. She would no longer simply dream of freedom. She would plan it, down to the last breath. Every day after the man was carved open on the altar, Isabella carried the smell of his death inside her. It clung to her hair, her breath, her very skin. And yet, in that rot she found resolve. She knew now that this cult did not stop at the innocent. It devoured anyone, rich or poor, child or adult, as long as the ritual demanded it. And that meant it was not madness, it was hunger. Theirs was an engine of blood designed to maintain power. She overheard whispers about what the sacrifices meant. The elites believed the spilling of blood strengthened their hold on wealth, health, and secrecy. They claimed Lucifer blessed them with influence, with doors opening that no ordinary man could touch. And strangely, Isabella had proof it was working. Men who attended the rituals never faced consequences. One was a judge. Another was a physician. Another, a politician whose face she had seen on television. They returned to their public lives smiling, shaking hands, celebrated by the world, while beneath their suits lay the stink of blood. Isabella realized that if she ran to the authorities, she would be delivered right back into the cult's arms. Her escape would have to be perfect, invisible, silent. She would need not just courage, but cunning. The preparations began in secret. Isabella began to carve a map of the mansion into her mind. She counted steps in the corridors, noted which doors creaked and which were silent, which windows were barred and which were merely locked. During ceremonies, while others chanted, she studied. During punishments, while she was left alone, she memorized. And all the while, she learned the cult's calendar. Rituals followed cycles: new moons, solstices, eclipses. There were nights when the house was crowded and guarded, and nights when only a skeleton crew remained. She noticed that after large sacrifices, many members left drunk, dazed, careless. That was her chance. But she also knew her grandmother suspected her, watching with hawk-like eyes. To hide her intent, Isabella began acting broken again, shuffling, obeying, pretending her spirit was gone. It was theater and it worked. The more she played the role of a shattered doll, the less they feared her. That invisibility was her weapon. But the weapon had to be sharpened with something else. Knowledge of where the cult's reach ended, if it ended at all. One night, while cleaning in a forbidden study, Isabella found a ledger. It was not left carelessly, nothing in that house was. Perhaps it was meant as another form of torment. Inside were lists of names, donations, transactions. But what chilled her blood was the column labeled offerings. Next to certain names were symbols: crosses, crescents, crowns. These were not just cultists. They were doctors who performed abortions in secret. They were lawyers who silenced accusations. They were police officers who ensured reports were lost. It was a web more vast than Isabella had imagined. She realized her grandmother was merely a node, a servant of something larger, a society that cloaked itself in ancient ritual but fed on modern systems of power. Every missing child, every runaway, every unsolved disappearance might not be random. They could be offerings fed into this machine. The knowledge nearly crushed her. Escape would mean more than running from her family. It would mean outrunning the very institutions the world trusted. But knowledge is double-edged. It wounds and it arms. Now Isabella knew the scale of her enemy. And knowing is the first weapon of freedom. But knowledge alone could not set her free. She needed timing. She needed a miracle. That miracle came not in light but in shadow. One evening, after a ritual where infants were burned in a brazier of iron, Isabella was ordered to scrub the remains. Alone in the chamber, she heard footsteps. A man entered, a new recruit, younger than the others, his mask hanging awkwardly in his hands. For a moment their eyes met. And she saw it, the same flicker of horror she had felt years ago. He wasn't fully theirs. He whispered, barely audible, "Don't look at me." Then he dropped a key, deliberate, on the floor near her bucket. Isabella froze, unsure if it was a trap. But when she bent down, the key was real, cold in her palm. That night, she cried silently in her cell, not from fear, but from hope. The cult was not invincible. Cracks were forming. Even within their ranks, fear ate them. And in fear, mistakes are made. That key was not just iron, it was possibility. Her second escape would be different. No desperation, no sprinting barefoot into headlights. This time, Isabella planned with precision. She memorized the shift of guards, the rotation of members, the nights when her grandmother drank heavily. She kept the key hidden beneath her tongue when searched, pressed in cloth when she slept. Every day was a performance of defeat, every night a rehearsal of freedom. The rituals grew more grotesque, but now she viewed them differently. The blood, the ash, the mock marriages, the feasts of flesh, they were still horrors, but she saw their desperation. These men and women needed ritual to convince themselves they were gods. Without it, they were nothing but cowards hiding behind masks. That realization gave her strength. She told herself, "They fear me more than I fear them, because I can leave, and they cannot." When the night came, summer solstice 1989, she would use the key. She would crawl through shadows, slip through doors, and vanish into the night. But the cult would not let her go easily. And what she did not yet know was that freedom would cost her more than blood. It would cost her identity. The summer solstice arrived, the longest night of the year. The cult gathered in the great hall, their masks gleaming under candlelight. Tonight's ritual was rumored to be the most extravagant yet, an offering of 3 children stolen from a foster home 2 towns away. Isabella was forced to prepare the altar, her hands trembling as she polished the knives. But beneath her terror pulsed a secret heartbeat. Tonight was the night. She had rehearsed every step in her mind. She knew which guard would stumble drunk first, which hallway would echo least, which window latch could be jimmied with the stolen key. When the chants rose, when drums thundered, Isabella's mask of obedience dropped away. She whispered to herself, "Now." And in a single motion she slid into the shadows and disappeared. The corridors stretched like veins of a monster, every step threatening to echo too loudly. The key slid into locks with terrifying slowness. Twice she froze as footsteps passed, the sound of heavy boots dragging across stone. At one point she had to press herself against the wall as a priestess walked by carrying a bowl filled with what looked like human eyes, floating in wine. Isabella's heart slammed, but she remained unseen. When she finally reached the cellar door, she thought she was safe. But the door creaked as it opened, a sound that seemed to scream across the halls. She ran, sprinting through the cellar toward the back exit. Behind her, faintly at first, came the sound of pursuit, voices, shouts, the pounding of feet. They had noticed. Her second escape had begun, and this time the hunt was bloodthirsty. The night air struck her face like baptism, sharp and cold. She burst into the woods behind the mansion, branches tearing her arms, roots clawing at her ankles. The cult was close behind, their torches flickering through the trees like fireflies of hell. They called her name in chants, voices layered in unholy rhythm, as if even the pursuit itself was a ritual. She ran until her lungs burned, until the taste of blood filled her mouth. At last, through the trees she saw headlights. A road. A car. Salvation. She stumbled out, waving frantically. The car screeched to a halt. The driver, a middle-aged man in a sheriff's uniform, stepped out. Relief flooded Isabella. Law. Order. Safety. But then he smiled. And in the flicker of headlights she saw it. A ring on his finger. The same sigil as her grandmother's. The cult was waiting for her in the open world. The sheriff didn't arrest her. He didn't strike her. He simply tipped his hat and said, "The road only goes where we want it to." Behind him, more headlights appeared. Cars pulling up, doors slamming shut. Cultists, without their masks, emerging like ordinary townsfolk. A baker. A teacher. A nurse. The faces of everyday life, now unveiled as predators. Isabella realized in that moment that the mansion was not a prison. It was merely the heart of something far larger. The cult was the town. The neighbors. The police. The doctors. This web stretched so far that escape was not a matter of running, it was a matter of tearing out its roots. But how? She was one girl barefoot hunted. For the first time her courage faltered. Perhaps there was no freedom. Perhaps she was destined to be dragged back to the altar. And then something unexpected happened. The young recruit, the one who had given her the key, stepped forward from the crowd. His face pale, his hands trembling. "No more," he said. His voice cracked but carried. The cult turned toward him, shocked. In his hand was not a mask but a pistol, shaking, aimed at the sheriff. "Run," he hissed at Isabella. For a heartbeat the entire world seemed to freeze. Torches crackled. Insects hummed. And Isabella, heart exploding in her chest, made her choice. She ran again, not back into the woods, not toward the cars, but into the black unknown of the highway, trusting nothing but her own legs and the sliver of hope that the world was larger than the cult's reach. Behind her she heard the gunshot. Then another. Then screams. The night did not swallow her, it spit her out, wounded but alive. But she knew survival was only the beginning. The cult was everywhere. And they would never stop hunting their lost blood. Dawn bled across the horizon as Isabella stumbled barefoot along the deserted highway. Her body ached, her throat raw, her skin torn. Every passing minute felt stolen. Every sound, an engine in the distance, a rustle in the grass, triggered panic. When she finally reached a truck stop, she thought she had found reprieve. Neon lights hummed above greasy windows, the smell of coffee and diesel filling the air. She slipped inside, trying to appear like just another tired traveler. But the walls were lined with flyers, missing children, unsolved murders, faces of the forgotten. She scanned them with trembling eyes until one stopped her cold. It was her own face. Younger. Well, the caption, missing since 1983. And in bold red letters, someone had scrawled beneath, found by the faithful. Her stomach dropped. Even here, miles from the mansion, the cult had marked her. The waitress approached with a pot of coffee. She smiled too warmly, too knowingly. Isabella forced a nod, clutching the mug as if it were an anchor. But then the waitress leaned close, whispering words that turned the air to ice. The black sun rises, child. You can't run from family. Isabella dropped the cup, ceramic shattering across the floor. The truckers looked up, unimpressed, as though this outburst was nothing unusual. Everyone seemed indifferent. Everyone except the waitress, who didn't blink as blood dripped from Isabella's trembling fingers where the shards had cut her. They'll be here soon, the woman continued, calm as scripture. Sit tight. Terror surged through Isabella. She bolted from the diner, the bell above the door clanging like an alarm. She didn't stop until her legs gave out in the dirt field beyond. The world had turned into a stage, and every actor was in the cult service. Exhaustion forced her into sleep among weeds and shadows. But sleep was no escape. She dreamed of black-robed figures gathered beneath a sky that pulsed like a living organ. They spoke in tongues older than any language she had heard, slicing symbols into their own flesh, letting blood pour into chalices carved from bone. At the center, a great pit yawned open, and from it rose an obsidian idol with hollow eyes that dripped tar. Its voice vibrated through her chest. You are mine. You carry me. She woke with a scream, dirt clinging to her skin, only to see a stray dog staring from the edge of the field. Around its neck was a collar branded with the sigil, the very same mark she had seen carved on altars. Even animals wore their chain. Nowhere was untouched. By nightfall, she found herself in the outskirts of another town. Desperate for shelter, she slipped into an old library, its lights flickering, dust choking the air. She collapsed into a chair, trying to steady her breathing. But then she noticed the books. Entire shelves dedicated to occult volumes, leather-bound tomes whose titles burned her eyes when she tried to read them. She opened one at random, pages filled with diagrams of bodies, organs labeled with names of demons, instructions for offerings to the Eater between worlds. She flipped faster, heart hammering, until she found a photograph pressed between pages. A ritual chamber. An altar. And at its center, herself as a child, bound and drugged, eyes rolled white. The photo trembled in her hands. She wasn't just running from them. She had already been used by them in ways she couldn't remember. She wasn't only a victim, she was an artifact of their faith. The creak of footsteps pulled her back to the present. A figure stood at the far end of the library. Tall. Watching. Slowly it moved closer, the glow of an exit sign painting its silhouette red. Isabella backed away, clutching the cursed photograph, every nerve alight. You've always belonged to us, the figure said, voice deep and strangely familiar. Your blood carries the covenant. You can't sever it. As it stepped into the weak light, she saw his face, the sheriff again. His smile stretched, unnatural, his eyes reflecting the exit sign as if lit from within. He raised a hand, not in threat but in welcome. Come home, he said. And though every instinct screamed to run, Isabella realized something horrifying. He wasn't chasing her anymore. He was waiting. Because the real trap was not in the mansion, not in the town, but inside her own blood. The cult's legacy wasn't outside, it was within. Isabella fled the library before the sheriff's hand could touch her. Her lungs burned, her heart tearing itself apart inside her chest. But no matter how far she ran, she felt his gaze on her, as if it had already rooted itself into her veins. At the edge of town she collapsed beside a rusted playground, swings creaking in the wind. For a moment she let herself believe she had escaped. But then, faint at first, she heard it, a low humming. A chant. It rose from the houses around her. Windows glowed faintly with candlelight. Shadows moved behind curtains. The whole town was singing in one voice, words older than the soil. She clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the chant wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her bones, vibrating with each syllable. The covenant is blood. The covenant is eternal. A man approached from the darkness, hunched and frail, his eyes wild. You feel it, don't you? He rasped. The covenant's tether. He was no stranger. His face appeared in her memories of the rituals, though she couldn't place him. They'll never let you go because you were born for the pit. Your mother carried you to be the vessel. And your father? He trailed off, his voice shaking. He wasn't human. Isabella's breath faltered. What do you mean? She whispered. The man gripped her shoulders with skeletal fingers. The black sun doesn't just take worship. It breeds. You are the child of their pact. Half flesh, half abyss. His eyes filled with terror as he looked over her shoulder. And soon they'll claim the other half. Before she could ask more, headlights cut through the night. A black van. Men stepping out with ropes and hoods. The frail man shoved her away. Run. She didn't hesitate. She found herself cornered in the ruins of a church, its roof caved in, crosses snapped and scorched. The cult had long since hollowed this place out, replacing hymnals with grimoires. She crept through the pews, praying to remain unseen. But in the apse she saw them, black-robed figures in a circle, candles burning blue. They weren't chanting for her. They were preparing something. On the altar lay a body wrapped in burlap, twitching faintly. With a single slash, the burlap fell open, revealing a man with stitched lips, eyes wide in terror, but unable to scream. They carved sigils into his chest, pouring his blood into bowls. Then one priestess lifted a vial of thick black fluid and dripped it into the wounds. The man convulsed. His eyes turned jet black, his veins crawling with darkness. He was being hollowed, reshaped. Isabella nearly vomited. This wasn't worship. It was manufacturing vessels. And she knew then, she wasn't their first experiment. She was their perfected one. A sound betrayed her, a gasp she couldn't hold. Every hood turned at once. The priestess smiled beneath her veil. She's here. The congregation erupted in shrieks that weren't human, voices tearing through the rafters like glass breaking. Isabella bolted, scrambling over pews, the floorboards slick with blood. Hands clawed at her from the dark, but she escaped into the night, sprinting through graveyards littered with broken stone. The chants followed her. The vessel returns. The vessel returns. Her mind fractured between running and the gnawing realization that her entire life, every scar, every missing year, every dream, was by design. They hadn't lost her. They had been letting her ripen. The escape she thought she earned was only the illusion of choice. And the ritual was not ahead. It had already begun the day she was born. By morning, Isabella found herself in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse, hiding among rotting crates and dust-choked air. She clutched the photograph she had taken from the library, the proof she was part of their rites. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She thought of her mother, of the faceless men, of the sheriff. Every fragment pieced into one revelation. She was never meant to escape. She was the ritual itself. The cult's forbidden text spoke of the marriage of blood and void, a ceremony that would seal the black sun into flesh permanently. That flesh was hers. And if they succeeded, it wouldn't just consume her. It would open the pit forever. As she sat in the silence, she noticed something worse. Her veins, once blue beneath her pale skin, were darkening. Slowly. Thickly. Like ink spreading beneath glass. The abyss wasn't chasing her anymore. It was waking up inside her. Isabella woke to iron chains biting into her wrists. The farmhouse was gone. Now she hung inside a cavernous chamber carved beneath the earth. The walls were slick with something alive, pulsing veins of stone that glistened as if breathing. Torches burned with black fire, casting shadows that bent unnaturally. Before her, the congregation stood robed and waiting, their faces painted in ash and blood. And in the center, a monolith of obsidian rose, covered in spirals of bone. At its base, the sheriff raised his hands. His voice was steady, commanding. Tonight, the pit marries flesh. The vessel takes her throne. Isabella's scream was drowned by the choir. Hundreds of voices chanting in a tongue that split her skull open. Her body convulsed, chains rattling. It wasn't just fear anymore. Something inside her was answering the chant. Something that wasn't hers. The priestess approached, her veil gone. Her eyes glowed with crimson fire, her mouth full of sharpened teeth. In her hands she carried a bowl brimming with blood and oil. She painted symbols across Isabella's stomach, chest, forehead, each stroke burning like acid. Then she whispered, close enough that Isabella felt her breath. You are the gateway, child. Your blood closes the covenant, your womb births the abyss. The words ripped through her mind. Isabella felt the chains grow hotter, branding her wrists. The congregation erupted in screams of ecstasy as the monolith began to shift, splitting open like a jaw, revealing an endless black throat spiraling down. From within, whispers poured out. Whispers that knew her name, her memories, her secret fears. They weren't summoning a god. They were summoning her completion. The sheriff drew a blade forged of bone and obsidian, its edge slick with something thicker than blood. He raised it above her chest. The vessel must be opened. Isabella thrashed, her body seizing as visions invaded her mind. Herself crowned in shadows, armies of eyeless worshippers bowing to her, rivers of fire pouring from her outstretched hands. A part of her wanted it. The whispers promised freedom, power, an end to her suffering. But another part, the small human part, screamed to resist. She forced her head up and spat blood at the sheriff's face. I'm not yours. His smile didn't falter. You already are. The blade plunged downward, yet in that instant the ground itself buckled. A violent quake shattered the chamber, stones crashing down. From the pit came not a god, but a swarm of shadows, writhing, hungry, uncontrolled. Even the cult screamed. They had opened too far, too fast. The swarm devoured them. Priests torn apart, their screams blending with the chants into a grotesque harmony. The sheriff's face melted into black ash as he was consumed. The priestess's glowing eyes burst like glass, blood raining over the altar. Chains snapped as the shadows reached for Isabella, wrapping around her arms and legs, caressing her skin like old friends. Come home, they whispered. Her veins throbbed black, her vision collapsing into tunnels of fire and bone. Yet somewhere within the storm she saw her mother, young, afraid, hiding her infant from the congregation. She saw the truth. Her mother had tried to save her, but failed. The cult had taken her anyway. That last fragment of love pierced through the void. Isabella screamed, not in surrender but in defiance. She grabbed the obsidian blade from the sheriff's remains and drove it into her own chest. The shadows froze. The chamber fell silent. From the wound in Isabella's chest poured not blood, but pure darkness, pouring into the pit, collapsing the monolith, silencing the whispers. Her body glowed faintly, cracks of light splitting across her skin as the abyss fought to consume her. For the first time, the cult's creation refused them. I am not your vessel, she whispered. Then the light exploded. The cavern imploded in fire and stone, burying the congregation, sealing the pit. When the smoke cleared, there was no trace of the chamber, no cult, no sheriff. Only rubble and silence. But in the distance, on the wind, one might swear they heard it. The covenant is eternal. And as dawn broke across the horizon, Isabella, bloodied, broken but alive, staggered from the ruins. Her chest wound was gone. Her veins were blue again. But her shadow did not move with her. It lingered. It writhed. It waited. The black sun was not gone. It was inside her now.